Morning, everybody. It's fabulous to see so many people in here, and I thought I'll start on time because I've got quite a lot that I want to get through. But anyway, a very warm welcome to my 6th Groceries Code Adjudicator Conference. So I wanted to start by saying today, for me, is a number of high points. First of all, I want to welcome our 2 additional designated retailers. We have Ocado and B&M here today, and they're at the conference for the first time. Another high point is I have had the highest ever number of responses to the annual survey. That was over 1,500 responses. And also, there are more of you here today than I have had in any previous conference. So thank you all very much for coming. The conference will close around 20 to 12, and we'll have coffee, and then lunch will be served from about 12 o'clock. And then there's, so from about 20 to 12 onwards, there's lots of informal networking, and I will be joining for some of it. But during that lunch period, so 20 to 12 onwards, all the retailer code compliance officers are going to be available to have informal conversations with suppliers. I've actually told them not to have any notepads out. They've certainly not got any recorders on. I think that you might, so often when people come to see me, I said, but have you spoken to the code compliance officer about it? They're reasonable people. They are there to protect their business from breaking the code. So I really do suggest that you have a chat with them. And I think also they'll be very pleased if you just go up and say, I just want to let you know how much easier it is to sort out invoice problems than it used to be. So you can give them some compliments as well. It doesn't all have to be about any issues. So this year's conference theme, I thought I'd just press that, there we are, is driving effective compliance risk management. So this is obviously with the retailers. And I'm going to be talking a lot today about my regulatory journey that's led to real change in the behaviour of the retailers and how a comprehensive code compliance risk management approach can be embedded in the retailers to secure the progress of the past is secured and to make sure that there's progress for the future. Just a few housekeeping things, though. There's the hashtag GCA 2019. Anybody wants to tweet. Some people might want to turn their phones to silent if they haven't done already. The usual, not expecting any fire drills. And the wonderful thing about this room is that there are so many doors to get out of that you're not going to have any problems. Then just keep following the green signs. I'm not going to tell you where the toilets are because they're just, there's so many doors, I couldn't tell you where they are on each one, but they're all well signposted. So this bit of the presentation for me, or my first presentation, is reporting on my annual report, and you'll all have received a copy of that thick blue document today. It sets out what I'm required to report on by the Act. And this list here, that is actually all that I am required to report on. So I can report that we had 2 arbitrations that closed during the year, and the year ended with no open arbitrations. And I repeat the point I made last year, that arbitrations are costly, lengthy legal processes, and that I'm an arbitrator, I'm not a mediator. So there's a limit to the extent I can assist the parties to get a reasonable commercial outcome. I'll always do my best to help the parties to narrow the issues as soon as possible and to be realistic in an attempt to save everybody both time and costs. But my capacity to do that is very limited as an arbitrator. Suppliers and retailers should therefore attempt to resolve all issues at the earliest possible stage through commercial discussion or mediation if necessary. And I can't emphasize it enough. Raising issues promptly allows for possible solutions. For example, getting an extension to a notice period or something like that. Waiting can make those sorts of solutions impossible for retailers to deliver. So if you wait till you've actually been delisted and then say, well, actually, I would have liked 4 more weeks, that's quite difficult for them to do. And this year I concluded the investigation into the cooperative group, and I made recommendations to the retailers, which I will come back to in some detail. And I made no recommendations to the Competition and Market Authority for changes to the code. But of course, I do a lot more than meet my statutory objectives, and although my main focus last year, which took half my time and half of Helen, my lawyer's time, so my main focus was obviously investigation, but I continued to work against the 4 strategic objectives that I set myself in 2015. So the first of these is promoting the work of the GCA. The Code Confident campaign, the logo you will see on everything you've got on your packs, launched in October 2017 to build awareness of the code, and it encourages suppliers to know the code, get trained, and speak up. Speak up to the buyers, to me, to code compliance officers. And it's starting to pay dividends. More suppliers are being trained, and increasingly, when they ask to speak to me about their experience with retailers, it's obvious they know what they're talking about. It's particularly encouraging that I'm hearing more issues against a backdrop of continual decline in code-related issues reported in my annual surveys. But I gave my team the challenge, I don't think they listened very hard, that I wanted to attend at least one trade or supplier event a month. And you can see I ended up going to 44. And 19 different locations across the UK. I think once we started asking and offering to go to things, that people kept saying yes, and therefore we continued to do, we took up all the challenge. And I am very grateful to all of the organisations, trade associations and suppliers that have hosted me during the year. There are now over a dozen businesses providing training on the code, and some of them update me on what code-related issues they're hearing about from suppliers and the number of people they've trained, and that's all very helpful. But thanks to all of these awareness-raising activities, I've had a continual flow of supplier feedback. Of course, I'm not content and want to hear more, but let me stress now that I always do whenever I'm in front of suppliers, that I have a statutory duty of confidentiality, and I can take action to help change things for the future. I'm always very careful in the way I raise issues with retailers, partly to protect my sources, but also because I want them to have a proper look at their businesses and identify all of the areas where a similar practice may be taking place. So if I hear about something in fresh produce, I want them to make sure that they're not doing it in ambient as well. So I won't necessarily point them to exactly where they need to look. Next objective that I set myself is to provide advice and guidance. And I've continued to do that. Last June, I published a revised best practice statement on forecasting, which included the issue of promotions. Not that promotions is a huge issue, but whenever I talk to people about what their forecasting problems are, they end up talking about a promotion. In it, I reiterated retailers should consider what improvements they could make to the transparency of their communications with suppliers about forecasting. Better communication should allow suppliers to meet orders and calculate the full costs of supply. And I've also made clear my view that retailers should consider explaining to suppliers how to get compensation for inaccurate forecasting, when it might be due and who to talk to. And they should consider the extent to which they might offer compensation for inaccurate forecasting themselves, and to be aware that the due care test, which has the forecast been prepared with due care, is unlikely to be met if they provide no way for a supplier to contribute to the forecasting process. I also, in the best practice statement, made some additional points in relation to promotions, including that retailers should that buying in periods for promotions were reasonable and in particular do not exceed the shelf life of the product, as well as ensuring that timelines are adhered to and commitments to promotions are delivered in store. And if retailers follow these principles and suppliers tell them when forecasts don't look right, I'm sure that there can be even more progress on that issue. And I've also said before how valuable the retailer annual compliance reports are that they give to me and to the CMA, but also what they put into the public domain. And the quality of all of these has improved significantly in the last year, after I gave them advice on what I expected to see. And I'm pleased that there's been a huge improvement in the level of detail of what retailers are putting into the public domain in their annual reports, which some of you might be interested to see. I know that some people actually look at those in great detail. And of course, another one of my objectives is to act on supplier issues. Now, I continue to meet the retailers regularly to raise all of the issues, as well as I continue to raise issues across all the regulated retailers, as well as some with individual ones. When I think there's some urgency for a code compliance officer to look into an issue, or I need to intensify my collaborative approach with a retailer, I obviously raise issues outside the usual meeting round. Issues that suppliers and trade associations raise with me, whether through contact in the office, at events, or inviting me to visit them, or through the survey, are crucial to identifying the work that I need to do with retailers. And all of this information has helped me to determine where I need to intensify the collaborative approach. And they've led to real solid outcomes. The publication of case studies or the launch of an investigation, as well as helping me decide which issues I need to prioritise. And where issues have been escalated with the retailer and have dealt with effectively, suppliers notice the difference, and retailers often make systems or process improvements which benefit their businesses as themselves and the wider supplier base. So I can't repeat it enough times. Please talk to me or my team. And I trust that you've all seen that following my recommendations made specifically to Tesco in January 2016, all retailers now have a supplier helpline, and the information for that is available on my website. These have been set up to help suppliers have finance-to-finance discussions with retailers to resolve payment issues without needing to involve the buyers. It also helps the retailers to identify the root causes of issues that suppliers are facing and to put them right. This year, there have been no new case studies, but there have been a number of occasions when I have raised an issue with a retailer that I've heard about from suppliers. They have looked at it themselves and dealt with it immediately and assured me that the situation has been remedied for suppliers. Or, as in one case, no supplier had yet been charged. They'd been written to, but not yet charged. And as a result, I judged it unnecessary in those circumstances to escalate them to a case study. So it doesn't mean that nothing came up, it just means it didn't become a case study. And I think one of the things I'm most pleased with is to report that there have been instances when a retailer's code compliance officer has contacted me directly to say they have come across a potential code breach and were actively putting it right, but wanted me to hear about it from them before I heard about it from suppliers. Examples like this help me to reinforce my belief that the code compliance officers are acting honourably and with the best intentions to make their businesses better and to put things right. And I take great pleasure in reporting that suppliers really do notice the difference when I get involved. Recently, having taken up an issue, I commented to the supplier that often the very fact that I've raised it makes a difference. And the supplier replied, and I quote, "I'm convinced that this is the case, and thanks for all the work you've done so far to bring the retailers into line, generally making it a more level playing field and making it more pleasurable to do business with them." And it's comments like that which are the reasons I took on the GCA role and take so much pride in doing the job. So my next objective is improving the culture of code compliance, and I continue to emphasise the need for cultural and behavioural change in retailers, and I always raise this when I meet the chairs of the retailer audit committees and the chief executives, and during visits to their headquarters. And I now consider that significant progress has been made here. Improving the culture of code compliance has been a feature of 2 GCA code clarification case studies and the recently published report of the investigation into Co-op, which I will now come on to. Well, I'd like to say I hope you've all read the investigation report and not just the executive summary. There's quite a lot more in it than was in the summary. I particularly recommend that suppliers read it in detail. I know that all of the retailers have done so. But I will just run through the findings here to refresh your memories and so that you understand a bit more about what I'm going to say next. So in terms of my findings, I investigated on 2 areas, one of which was delisting without reasonable notice. And in the first set of findings on delistings, I found that the Co-op applied the code wrongly in relation to the reasonable notice requirement of paragraph 16 of the code. They delisted suppliers with no or short fixed notice periods that were determined and applied unilaterally and were not reasonable in the circumstances. And they applied standard notice periods contrary to the code, my delisting guidance, and my supplementary delisting guidance, all of which specify that notice of delisting should be considered on a case-by-case basis. And they also failed to identify circumstances in which the delisting provisions may have been engaged because it didn't consider changes that may have amounted to a significant reduction in volume. A significant reduction in volume is also a delisting. And significance should be considered on a case-by-case basis, and it was not. Often it was not considered at all. There are no fixed or safe or figures or percentages to help retailers assess significance when making volume reductions. But if significant volume reductions are being made, suppliers need to be given reasonable notice of them. This too needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis, and it was not. And so reasonable notice is unlikely to be capable of being determined by any retailer without information from the relevant supplier. And you'll see those words coming up in my recommendations. And on the second one was on variation of supply agreements without reasonable notice. And I found that Co-op unilaterally and without reasonable notice varied its supply agreements with suppliers by its application of depot quality control charges and benchmarking charges. And this caused particular difficulty for suppliers with fixed cost contracts. So you're on a fixed cost contract and new charges are being introduced during that contract. And so they would not have been able to amend their cost prices to take account of them. Co-op didn't appear to consider what constituted reasonable notice of the application of these new charges for suppliers on fixed cost contracts. And also, Co-op buyers were not aware of the likely amount of depot quality control charges or the likely amount and frequency of benchmarking charges, so were unable to give suppliers any notice of them. And in some cases, Co-op didn't provide sufficiently clear or detailed information to suppliers about the charges to enable them to form reasonable estimates of them. This next paragraph is very important. There should be no surprises to suppliers about charges or other changes to their supply agreements. No surprises. Suppliers set their cost prices to retailers on the basis of what they know or expect to happen. Once these are set, retailers should not move the goalposts. This is what the variation provisions of the Code are designed to protect against. But now I move on to the root causes of both breaches, which is where it gets interesting. When, as I had promised the Co-op that I would do at the beginning, I started to look for the root causes of the breaches, I found that they were actually the same for both the delisting and the variation of the agreements. More interesting still, there were strong similarities to the root causes that I uncovered with both the Asda and Morrisons with both Asda and Morrisons when I worked with them on what were to become two substantial published case studies in previous years. In carrying out the Co-op investigation, I grasped that I was onto something that could move the whole sector forward, just like I had done following my first investigation into Tesco with delay in payments and unilateral deductions. And the root causes were as follows. There were failures in all of these. In compliance risk management, proactively undertaken at all levels in the business. In legal, compliance and audit functions working together to support code compliance. In internal systems and processes working to support code compliance. In training on the code. And in communication between the retailers and suppliers, facilitating code compliance. And getting these elements right is vital for all retailers who are seeking to minimize their code compliance risk. They come into play from the very top to the bottom of each retailer and should operate in a continuous feedback loop. The failure to take a joined-up whole organisation approach was fundamental to Co-op breaking the code, and an absence of these common factors in any other retailer will act as a red flag to me to look more closely at that retailer's code compliance. Time and time again, in 2 case studies and in extensive engagement with the Co-op leading up to the investigation, I've seen how these factors influence, if not determine, whether or not a retailer is likely to be breaking the code. And in my next presentation, I'll put this into graphic form, and it will demonstrate how a retailer can become a self-regulating entity, able effectively to deliver code-compliant behaviour and outcomes. And about this whole possibility of them doing everything themselves, I'm actually quite excited. But, of course, there's a range of possible solutions to this challenge I'm setting them. It has to be flexible because each of the businesses I regulate are different, and it's not my job to tell them how to work. It is my job to ensure they meet their duties under the code, and experience has shown me that if they're doing these 5 things correctly, they're probably getting their overall code compliance right. But conversely, if there are systemic weaknesses in any of these areas, compliance is likely to suffer. Now, I made 5 robust recommendations to the co-op, and I'll be helping them change its approach by monitoring closely how they implement these recommendations. Ultimately, I launched this investigation to help co-op get things right for the future, and my enforcement measures are focused entirely on that end. Now, my wider learning points from the investigation relating to the root causes are, as you'll see, going to shape my activity as regulator of the whole cohort of retailers for the year ahead. And I'm excited that I've come far enough to be able to do this. But there's no new law here, no new point of interpretation of the code. All this was clear before the investigation was launched. But what this investigation has enabled is a firm step change in the way I will work with all regulated retailers from now on. But I'm going to end with a quick reflection on my top issues that you've heard so much about over the years. Last year, I announced that following the survey results, I'd got no current top issue to work on with the retailers, but that I would formally monitor their performance in delay in payments, forecasting and promotions. And they did all of that and reported back to me by the end of March this year. So I'm going to report on that in my next presentation because that's clearly not in my annual report. But I am working with Ocado and B&M on all of the previous and the monitored top issues, and we're going to use the 2019 survey results to show with each of them where particular focus might be needed. So you can see that there's been significant continued process, and hopefully we'll hear some more in a minute from Gavin, and a potentially game-changing outcome as a result of the investigation. I am looking forward to working with all the retailers on the next steps in driving effective compliance risk management. I know it's a mouthful, but you need to say all those things. Driving effective compliance risk management at all levels in each of the regulated businesses. And I just want to say before I leave this bit of my presentation, to say a big thank you to my team for their support, their challenge, not always welcome, most of the time welcome, and their resilience over the past year. In particular, I was out of the office so much on the co-op investigation that the people in the office almost felt like we were 2 different businesses, and there's only 6 of us, so that was hard. But thank you to all of them. I'm extremely grateful.